It is my honor today to introduce to you Mr. Greg Dunn. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of his wife Shannon and his personal assistant Janet. It's a real treat to have them both with us today. Greg oversees global security for the LDS Church with more than 25 years of experience in security risk management and major criminal investigations, forensic audits, and security program design. Dunn is a certified public accountant and a former special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Prior to his current position as Managing Director of Church Security, Dunn was the Deputy Head of Security for British Petroleum, where he managed global security operations in the Western Hemisphere and Asia Pacific. He was also one of BP's managers in the Fraud Deterrence Program. Dunn received a BS in accounting from BYU in 1978 and is certified as a fraud examiner and as a protection professional with the American Society of Industrial Security. Greg is well known for his precise understanding of how to tackle tough security issues with eloquent public relations and customer service skills. In regards to the Kennedy Center's and BYU's international activities, Mr. Greg Dunn, also with his elite team of international security managers and advisors, have provided BYU with priceless international security analysis and help. Today is my honor to present to you Mr. Greg Dunn.
Thanks, Landis. We at Church Security feel it a privilege to have sort of a partnership with several groups down here at BYU, and Landis and Jan Van Oren represent part of that. And Chief Stott, would you stand up for a sec? Chief of BYU Police. We have a wonderful relationship and partnership with him also. Thank you for being here. We also have some special guests from the security at our local temple. If they would stand up, I would like you just to know that they're here. And I guess they came to see me and see if I had anything to say about their temple. But I'm going to be concentrating on more international issues today. The world can be a risky place, and I'm going to take a little bit of my time today to walk through what I think are some of the changes that are occurring in the world, security-wise. But I want to emphasize as we go through this, I think living and working internationally is very important. I think if you're part of a multinational organization or company, it can do nothing but enhance your career to live and work overseas. And I worked for a company for many years where that was part of the progression chain, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. And the reason I bring all that up is you can manage your risks wherever you are. The most important thing, or most important part of that, is to understand the risk. Once you understand what the risk is, then you can go about and manage it. So first we're going to talk about some of the risks that we're noticing in the world today, in a few parts of the world, and then we'll talk about managing risks. Was working. Yeah, there we go. So changing risks. These are the areas I'm going to talk about. We're going to talk about Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Russia, and then I'll offer a few thoughts on the Middle East, and then we'll spend the rest of our time talking about managing security risks. First of all, let's talk about Latin America. We've noticed some real positive changes in Latin America in the last 25 years. Democracy has been established and expanded in many of the nations there, and real economic growth is occurring in many of these nations. However, well, on the positive side, these terrorist groups that we see here in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile have largely been defeated in the last 10 years. That's a good thing. However, there are security problems that are growing in that area that are sort of filling in behind the defeat of these terrorist groups. For example, in Colombia, the FELN and the FARC have moved from what we would call to being a revolutionary group into an organized crime syndicate, and they function very well in that capacity. Also, the murder rate in the last 10 years has tripled in those three nations you see, Colombia, Argentina, and Peru. Let's take a look at the murder statistics, which I will use as sort of a barometer of how things are going in different parts of the world. I don't think any of us are surprised to see Medellin and Cali at the top of the list, but the numbers are quite staggering. You'll notice there's two cities from Guatemala that fall at the top of the chart, and especially when you compare it with like Tokyo at the bottom of the list. The U.S. State Department rates the cities in which they have embassies and consulates on a crime index of either being critical or high, medium or low. You'll notice in the last, from 1997 to 2003, the numbers of cities they considered to be critical or high went from 18 to 26. And here's the list of the cities, I'll let you look through for a minute, that they consider to be either critical or high crime cities. Kidnapping in Latin America is a real problem. Although we don't know the actual numbers because many kidnaps are not reported, it's widely believed from the numbers we have that Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil lead the world in kidnaps for ransom. Kidnapping is also becoming a problem in these other countries of Argentina, Peru, and Guatemala. In fact, recently, Guatemala is experiencing a high problem with what we call highway banditry. And traveling the roads outside of the cities in Guatemala can be a problem. Oops. This is supposed to back up, but it's not. So I've taken a minute to try and analyze why we're experiencing an increase in crime in Latin America. Some of the reasons are obvious, and some of them are not quite so obvious. First, as we know, poverty drives crime. The poverty index decreased in the early 1980s, but is raised to almost 40% by 2001. We see that the number of unemployed went from a little over 7.5 million to almost 20 million in a 10-year period. And also underemployment is a huge problem in Latin America. These countries have had a culture of violence. In the last 30 years, those countries that I've highlighted there have experienced civil war, government-sponsored violence, and terrorism in the last 30 years. So we have a generation that has grown up in those conditions. Also, urbanization. As elsewhere in the world, many people are moving from the relatively safe countrysides into the higher crime cities. There was a very interesting article written by Samuel Huntington, who's chairman of Harvard's Academy of International and Area Studies, and he opined that poverty alone is not enough to drive an increase in crime. He theorized that rising unmet expectations can produce violence and revolution. Now let's take a look at sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, in a micro view, is unstable, and the transfers of government in this part of the world rarely occur peacefully. South Africa is sub-Saharan Africa's most prosperous nation, but the crime there is increasing. Over 3,000 policemen have been killed in this country in the last 20 years. But South Africa should not be viewed as the most dangerous country in sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, far from it. Murder statistics that I just quoted do not include deaths that come from civil war or civil disobedience. Violent outbreaks have occurred in Liberia, Congo, Rwanda, Sudan, Ivory Coast, and Somalia. Without exception, South Africa, with the exception of South Africa and perhaps one or two other nations, there's never a change of government in a peaceful manner. Now, take that and compare it to Latin America. Latin America has reached a point where, although the change of government may be extra-constitutional, it often doesn't result in bloodshed or civil war. Let's take a look at Russia for a minute. Again, using the murder rate as sort of a measure, we can see that Russia falls below Colombia and South Africa, but is considerably higher than the United States or Canada. Unlike Latin America, we believe the crime rate here is driven by different factors: organized crime, severe alcoholism, and xenophobia, or radical nationalist fervor. The latter two, alcoholism and xenophobia, are the most likely to affect a traveler or expatriate living in Russia, unless you work for my old company, which was an oil company, and then sometimes we got mixed up with the organized crime group. But most security analysts have noticed that non-whites have a problem in Russia. This xenophobia or nationalist fervor is a problem. Unfortunately, the terrorism or crime or violence that's caused by alcoholism and xenophobia are harder to defend yourself against. They're more random in nature. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Washington, D.C. is arguably one of the more dangerous cities in the world. The murder rate is one of the highest in the United States. Compared to our national rate of 6 per 100,000, they're 38 per 100,000, and larger than Russia at 23 per 100,000. However, you can travel to Washington, D.C. as a tourist and go to the monuments during the daytime and stay out of certain neighborhoods at dark, and you won't even know there's a problem there, because the violence tends to be specific due to location and time of day, whereas in Russia that's not so. It tends to flow in different directions, and therefore a tourist may feel less safe, and statistically be less safe, in Moscow than they would in our nation's capital. I'd like to talk for just a minute about radical Islamic terrorism in the Middle East. First off, I mean, you know from reading in the newspapers that Southeast Asia, Europe, and the United States are all possible targets of groups that are linked to Al-Qaeda. This is a chart that was put together by the World Market Research Center, and they kind of rate countries based on what they consider to be their risk of terrorism. I don't think any one of those 11 countries will surprise any of you, but this list was comprised before the bombing of the Marriott in Jakarta, Indonesia, and before the bombing of the Marriott in Pakistan. So this list is probably a very reliable list to look at from that standpoint. Despite this list, it's our thesis that we do not believe there's a high risk that Islamic terrorists would want to attack BYU or church headquarters in Salt Lake, or maybe even one of our chapels. And we believe this to be true for three reasons. First, it's a target-rich environment out there. There's a number of government buildings, high-profile businesses, hotels, fast food chains that are associated with the United States, for example, like McDonald's, and tourist locations. For example, this is a picture of the bombing of the Marriott Hotel in Jakarta. That sort of activity brings more publicity and a higher return to the terrorists than it would if they went after, an LDS chapel, for example. Secondly, the church enjoys, where the risk is greatest, the church enjoys relative anonymity. Obviously here in Provo and Utah, the church is very well known. In the United States, it's very well known. But you can start to travel in various places around the world, and the church isn't that well known. Now, BYU is doing a great job of helping us become better well known in the Middle East with a lot of their initiatives. Secondly, there is a history of Christian-Muslim violence in the world, but that's mainly in areas of the world where the church is not very strong. For example, Indonesia, Mindanao, and Nigeria. We believe that the risk to you or to me or to church members in general is being at the wrong place at the wrong time and becoming part of collateral damage from a terrorist attack. For example, I've stayed at the Marriott in Jakarta many times, and if you happen to be there when it happens, then you can become involved in it. Also, the risks vary by country and location. Even like within the United States, there are certain places have more risk than others. If you went to Egypt, there would be some places that would have more risk than others. And the other thing is the risk is real. We don't want to understate it, but it's not omnipresent. It's not everywhere all the time. This was my view of September 11th. I was attending meetings at BP's headquarters in New York and had this view of the planes striking the World Trade Centers. My wife had left to go sightseeing and got in the subway, and the subway takes her underneath the World Trade Center to get up at Battery Park there where you go out and see the Statue of Liberty. Fortunately, she was impressed to get off the subway and with thousands of other people walked to Midtown and joined me at the office where I was at because there was no way I could call her on her cell phone. Everything was down at the time. We stayed there 3 or 4 days because airline traffic was, of course, shut down. We were eventually able to rent a car and drive back to our home in Chicago. But the point of me showing you this is it was a terrible, tragic incident, and thousands of people died. Millions of people on the island of Manhattan lived. And so just because you're around one of these events or even in the same city doesn't mean you're going to be injured by the event itself. In fact, my wife and I still enjoy going back to New York. It hasn't destroyed our love of the city or visiting there. So what I'm saying here is we need to keep risks in perspective. The world is a risky place, including places in the United States, but you can travel and work overseas successfully and have a rewarding and safe experience if you can manage those risks. So I'm going to tell you my bear story now. Anybody heard my bear story? There were 2 guys who were camping, and they went out into the woods, and they took their tent, and they pitched their tent, and they were getting ready for bed, and they heard a bear outside the tent. And so the one guy reaches into his backpack and pulls out his running shoes and starts putting on his running shoes. And his partner said to him, "Are you crazy? There's no way you can outrun a bear." And the guy said, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." And there's a point to that story, actually. We don't want you to run away from your companion if your companion needs help. But you don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than the other guy. Criminals look for targets, and if you're making yourself a less attractive target, chances are the criminal will select someone else. There was actually a study done here in the United States, which we believe applies worldwide, in which they interviewed criminals who had been put in jail for muggings. And they went through and said, how did you select your target? And they went through what they were looking for. And the criminal made their selection in a 30-second period. They saw somebody, they looked like they were, didn't know where they were going, they were a little bit lost, they weren't moving along very quickly. And if they could get that person stopped, if they could get the person had something attractive they wanted. So if we can think about that sort of experience, what do you have with you? Are you moving along to where you want to go? Are you aware of the neighborhood you're in? Those sort of things are very important. So let's talk about security risk management. You do security risk management every day and you just don't think about it. My advice to you is just don't accept your risks. If you're going to go travel to Jordan, just don't get on the plane and go. Study about Jordan a little bit. It's a wonderful place to go, and there's some good things to do, and there's also some things you ought to know about that country. If you're going to go to Egypt, you ought to know what's going on in Egypt. You shouldn't just accept the risk. You should manage that risk, and the first step is to understand what the risks are. Again, the risks vary by country and location, and you must understand the specific risks in each location. For example, if I'm going to go to Egypt, I might visit Cairo and I might visit Luxor. I would want to know what's going on in those two places. When the attack occurred in the Sinai, remember that not too long ago with the Israeli tourists, there were warnings from the Israeli government not to go to the Sinai. People went anyway. They weren't managing their risk very well. And then I think you have to take personal responsibility for your own safety. You cannot give that away to somebody else. You have to own it. So anyway, what are some examples? How do we do it today? There's an estimated 43,000 people that will be killed in car wrecks in the United States this year. That's a huge risk when you think about it. So how do you manage that risk, knowing that that's probably going to happen to 43,000 people in the United States? You wear your seat belts. So if you're involved in a wreck, you can reduce the injuries. If you have children, you use the child safety seats as they're designed to be used. You don't drive during high-risk periods. I never let my kids drive on New Year's Eve, and they don't like me for it, but it doesn't happen. We obey the traffic laws. That's hard when you're late, I know, but it helps reduce your risk. And, of course, you have car insurance. So you probably didn't even think you're doing security risk management, but you do. You manage a risk of an accident every time, and you can apply sort of those same principles to living and traveling overseas. The first thing I suggest you do if you're going to move overseas or accept a job for some country, some company, say in Brazil, or you're going to travel to Chile, is that you do some pre-travel intelligence gathering. And you can do that yourself, and I'll show you how in a minute. If you know anybody that lives in that country, I would suggest you talk to them. They know how the airports work. They know what places are safe, when to arrive. If you have a friend living in Lagos, they can tell you exactly what your problems are going to be at the Lagos airport and how to get around. Take advantage of any security assessments that your organization or company may offer you. By that, most large companies have a security staff. BYU has great information. You can either, depending on where you're going, from Chief Stott or Landis. But again, you can do this self-assessment on the internet if it's not offered by your organization, or to supplement that which you get from your organization. This is the U.S. State Department's website, travel.state.gov. It's a wonderful website. It's full of information. It even tells you what places they recommend you not go to. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're forbidden from going there. There are some reasons sometimes you need to travel to some places for which there's a travel warning. But you would want to know if there's a travel warning for Haiti and you're going to go to Haiti. It talks about passports and those sort of things too. The Centers for Disease Control is a wonderful website. It tells you when you travel somewhere what kind of environment you're walking into. Is yellow fever a problem? Is malaria a problem? If so, you need to take care of that before you go. I put up the United Kingdom Foreign Service website. When I worked for British Petroleum, they thought the U.S. State Department was a little too gun-shy and a little too cautious. So a lot of the people I work for preferred to get their information from the British website. It's very similar, but they do look at things a little differently, and it's worth comparing notes. If you're going to travel to Asia Pacific, I strongly suggest you look at the Australian government's website. It's a wonderful source of information. All right, travel preparations. Before you ever leave home, you've done sort of your travel analysis. What else should you do before you ever leave? I would limit the knowledge of my itinerary to only those who need to know. But I would be sure that my family or somebody at work knew where I was going to be. And if my itinerary changed, I would let them know. If I go missing, I want them to know the last place I stayed and where I was headed. It's a great idea to have a photocopy of your passport somewhere, and extra passport pictures, a copy of your visa, and a copy of your tickets. If you lose your passport and your wallet, those things right there can put you very quickly back into business when you go to the U.S. Embassy or somewhere for help. I suggest you not wear logos that identify yourself or your organization. When I worked for Amoco and British Petroleum, everybody wanted to wear the Amoco logo or the British Petroleum logo. I just think it makes you that much more of a target. There's really no need for it. Wear something that says, nothing. Always carry identification with you, but a modest amount of cash. I always take a second credit card and put it away somewhere. You need a credit card to get by in the world today, but if you lose it, it's tough. The other thing I do is, and probably a lot of you do this already, most of the men take out your wallet. How big is it? How many things do you keep in your wallet here at BYU? You probably have 1,000 things in there you need every day. When I go overseas, I put that wallet in my little home safe, and I take out this little tiny wallet that holds 3 things. It holds my identification, a couple of credit cards, 4 things, and my health insurance. There's nothing else I need in that, and it goes in my front pocket. I would suggest that you try to avoid a late night arrival. Arriving at midnight in Lagos can be a tough experience. I've done it before. Arriving early in the day when you're alert, if you can, is a much better way to go. Don't take too many bags. I know it's always you're always not sure what you're going to need, but boy, I'll tell you what, if you're hauling 16 bags around with you, you're just a target for somebody depending on the airport you've arrived at. Again, the small wallet, small purse. Ladies, when you have the purse with the long cord, do you put it over your shoulder or do you put it over your head? If you put it over your head, what are you protecting? Your purse, right? If you put it over your shoulder, you're protecting your head, because I've seen where they grab that cord of the purse, and if it's around your head's going where they pull the purse. So if you have something that's so important that you need to protect your purse with your head, take it out and don't take it. There's nothing you have possession-wise that's worth your life. Nothing. There's nothing worth arguing with a criminal over. If they get your wallet, they get your wallet, because you've got Xerox copies, you've got backups anyway, right? Because you're traveling smart, you're okay. If they're going to take it, they're going to take it, and walk away from that thing without being hurt. That's the best advice I can give you. Don't defend your wallet or your purse or your bag. It's not worth it. More than likely, the greatest risk you take when traveling is a medical issue, not a criminal issue. So think through that before you go. If you're on prescription medicine, take extra. Don't take just enough to get you by if you need it. Take some extra prescription medicine with you and your prescription. And you'll find overseas you can buy a lot without a prescription anyway if you know what you're looking for. Take a copy of your eyeglass prescriptions and an extra pair of eyeglasses. I was with somebody who lost his eyeglasses. He couldn't see for a couple of weeks. I felt like I was leading him through Egypt for a while. He wished he had another pair. Know the availability and location of good medical care. You should know where to go. And I'd suggest you be careful. We had a policy at my old company. You did not ride in a taxi that didn't have working seat belts. If you got into a taxi that didn't have working seat belts, you got out and got in another one. Because if you get in a wreck in that taxi, it's just like your own car. You want to have a seat belt on. And wear it if it's there. And don't take unnecessary risks. sometimes when you're traveling, and if you get hurt in Bangladesh, that's a big problem compared to getting hurt in Sydney. The medical care is a lot different in those two places. So use your head when you're taking risks overseas. Okay, we're going to walk through a couple of, an acronym you might want to remember called WATCH OUT. The first one is W, walk confidently and avoid predictable patterns. Remember I told you how a criminal will target somebody? In 30 seconds, they're going to decide whether to rob you or mug you or not. And if you're walking quick with your head up and you know where you're going, they'll probably go to the next person that's kind of sightseeing and going slow. Avoid isolated areas. You don't need to. You got to be careful about cutting through some areas and some dark streets. Every time we have a problem with a missionary or something else, a lot of times it's because they were cutting through somewhere they didn't need to cut through. They could have stayed on the road, well traveled, and they'd have been better off. Take time to lock up. If you're staying in a hotel room, we'll talk about hotel rooms in a minute, use all the locks they give you. And you don't let strangers in your room. I can't tell you the number of times we had problems with people who got into hotel rooms with our employee. And if they would have just kept their door locked and used the peephole and identified them and then kept them out, it would have avoided a lot of problems. I'll tell you some stories in a minute. Check out your surrounding and avoid confrontations. If you see a fight, what does a young guy want to do? He wants to go watch it. Wrong move. Get out of there. Move for the fight. Two reasons. The fight could be a ploy to get you in close and get you involved in it. That happens a lot. They'll get people up looking at it, and then they will strike you while you're watching the fight and rob your belongings. The other thing is the police are going to come. And if you're in China, you don't want to be sorted out by the local gendarmes because you're near this fight. It's best just to leave. Hide your valuables, don't display wealth. We've talked about that. Observe those around you. If you're in a different place or you see a stranger 3 times, he may be following you. That's a good time to move on, get out of there, go to a store, go to somewhere. But I call it the 3 times rule. And use the buddy system. It's so much better to be with somebody. Your chances of being involved as a target in a criminal activity is so much less if you're with somebody. And then deny privacy. I've just made a personal decision. No one's taking me from a public place to a private place. I think my chances are a lot better in a public place. So I deny that privacy. And then trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it may not be. And maybe it's a good time to move on. And then have a contingency plan. If something doesn't feel right about your plan, go to your contingency plan and go somewhere else that day or a different way to get there. Let's talk about hotels for a minute. In the United States, who do you think is most often the victim of crime when they're traveling, men or women? Men, by far. So men, don't think you're impervious to crime when you're traveling. Select a reputable hotel. When you sign in, you don't need to use your first name. You can use your initial. For fire safety issues, a lot of people recommend floors 3 through 6, and depending on the country you're in, that may not be a bad selection if there's fire safety issues. Inspect your room completely when you go up there before you go in and close the door. Make sure that you're the one in the room. Check for emergency exits and fire escapes. My wife is very good. Every time she travels with me, she knows where the fire exit is, what floor we're on, how we're going to get out, and I'm glad she does it. Now she's got me doing it. It's an excellent thing to do to know where the fire escape is from your door, because if there's smoke in the hallway, it's hard to find. Use all the locks and your room safe. Not that that's going to guarantee it. Those room safes are not. I had a guy working for me travel to Africa. He lost $700 out of his safe. Safe was still closed. So, you know, small amounts of cash, I remind him about small amounts of cash. Verify all visitors and check them out. I want to spend just a minute on that. In the company I worked for before, a very senior female executive was traveling to Chicago and staying in probably the nicest hotel in Chicago. On the executive floor, you needed, you know, your card key to get up to that floor. Midnight, there's a knock on her door. She goes to the door. There's a man dressed in a hotel uniform. I have a message for you. She says, slide it under the door. Good move, right? He says, I'm sorry, I was instructed to give this to you personally. What do? She did the right thing. She went over to the phone, called down, said, I'm Mrs. So-and-so, I'm in this room. Did you send a message up for me? There's a man outside my door, says he has a message for me. They said, don't open the door, we'll send somebody right up. They had no message for her. So you need to be careful about it. We had an executive from my company was staying at a nice hotel in Houston. He just checked in. He's putting his bags down. There's a knock at the door. There's a man in a suit outside his door. What do you want? Through the door. He said, well, I'm in the room next to you. I don't have any yellow pages. Can I borrow your phone book? Sure. Opens the door up. The guy comes in. He's a professional. He ties the guy up, robs him, and he's lucky he's not hurt. Women need to be especially careful. You can be targeted in hotels. And what happens, and the way it works, is they watch people check in. And if you happen to be the one they select, they'll figure out what room you're in by following you up, or because the clerk isn't careful about announcing your name or room number. Then you'll get a knock on the door, and there'll be a person dressed in working clothes, and they'll say, I'm here to check your fire extinguisher. I'm here to check the smoke alarm. It's not working. Can I come in for a second? And then there is an assault. It happens more than we'd like to admit in the hotel industry. You don't let anybody in your room you don't know who they are. A very senior executive for Corning was killed in China. He was in a five-star hotel in Shenzhen. Gets a knock at his door. A man is out there. We don't know why. He opened up his door. The next thing they found him was dead in the doorway, and all his possessions were gone. You don't open up your door, even in nice hotels, for people you don't know. Taxi safety and security. I'll go through this quickly. If you're staying at a hotel, get your car and your taxi from the concierge. They'll help you stay safe. Don't flag taxis on the road. You don't know who's driving them. They don't have standards in many countries for who has taxis, and sometimes the taxi owner will lease it, lend it to somebody, and you just don't know who's in the taxi. A good advice is to know the appropriate fare from the concierge before you go on the trip, and agree to that before you take off. Have the address of your destination and the address of your hotel in the language of the country before you get in a cab. It saved me a lot of time to have a little card that says I'm staying at the Prince Hotel in Guangzhou, because when I try and get a cab from where I'm at, they're looking at me like, don't you speak Chinese? And I don't. Also, airports. How many have been through a gauntlet at the airport? I call the gauntlet is from the time you leave customs until you get to a car to your hotel. If you've been in airports like Lagos or Moscow, it is a zoo. And you don't know who's trying to get you in what car. And if you haven't got a clear idea of what car you're going to get into and where you're going to go, and you're carrying 50 bags, you're up for a fleecing. You're going to get picked clean. So you need to be careful and move along and know where you're going. I have provided a copy of this here. There's about 20 copies, hard copies, that we put together at the church. It's not copyrighted. It's just travel safety tips. I've also given it in a CD-ROM in case you want an e-version, and you're welcome to it, and you can just get it. Yep, Kennedy Center website, they'll put it up. And I think it's great tips. It walks through everything we've talked about. And before I take questions, I think there's another good reading you probably ought to look at in The Economist in August edition. It calls Doing Business in Dangerous Places. The Economist in that article reviews that we do have to do business in dangerous places and what companies owe their employees that work in those locations. Anyway, we've got 5 minutes, and I'm willing to take questions, and I may answer one. Yes?
What do you do to keep church leaders safe while they're traveling?
I can't talk specifically about what we do for the senior brethren, but I can tell you that the pre-travel assessment is absolutely critical, and we know in advance where people are traveling, and then let's say they're traveling to Africa, who's going to meet them, who's going to be there, is it, you know, those sort of things. So we do a lot of pre-travel assessments, and depending on the risk, we can do a lot of other things that you know I'm not at liberty to talk about. Any other questions? Everybody wants to get out 5 minutes early? Yeah, please.
With regards to hotel security, is there advantages of not staying at the most reputable, I mean, the highest of 5 stars, given some of the stories, or rather take more of the middle path?
There's always sort of a dilemma, and that's a very good one. I don't stay at the most expensive hotel because I can't afford it, so that's easy for me. But I do like, for example, I like to stay at Marriott's. I mean, it's like McDonald's. I always know what a Marriott's going to look like and what it's going to feel like. So I know the head of security for Marriott, Eleanor Lobby's a great guy, and I always just stay at those hotels. But there is sort of a risk. Marriott is becoming a little bit more high profile. We have not suggested that you shouldn't stay at a Marriott. I think a Marriott is a fine hotel. They're doing a lot of things. And I would suggest that whatever hotel you stay at, you need to manage your own risk. And you don't need to be shy. If they announce your name, if they give out your room number, you ask them for a different room. And they're there to help you. They're there to serve you. And if you're uncomfortable in a hotel, you should move. In fact, there are some places in the world that we recommend people not stay more than 4 or 5 days in the same hotel if they're there for a long time, that they actually move locations if you're a Westerner in a very high-risk location. Sorry, that's not a direct answer, but I think the cases I'm aware of where people have been hurt in these hotels has been because they didn't manage their own risk very well. Because I think some of these things would probably happen in other hotels as well. Are we done? Yes.
What do you do about church meetings and stuff in countries where there is a higher risk, like Liberia?
Generally speaking, let's take Nigeria, for example, as a country. They have 90,000 members of the church in Nigeria. We have a lot of church buildings, and we're constructing a temple. For the most part, the local congregations don't have serious security problems towards the church. In fact, we have more vandalism and arson in the United States against LDS churches than we do outside the United States. So we're actually more at risk in the United States from that respect. The brethren go to the meetings they're assigned to go to, and they love to be with the members of the church, and we do the best we can to make sure that's a safe experience for them. So if you have a high-profile visitor going into a risky country, we do a couple things. Sometimes they don't know a high-profile visitor is coming. He just shows up one day. You know, maybe 1 or 2 people know that the high-profile visitor is coming. And the other thing we do is we do a real pre-travel assessment. You know, what is the risk? Do we think the church at risk there? What's that location like? Those sort of things. Yes?
The in-room safes probably aren't a safety thing, but if you have to go, for example, we went to D.C. for a special convention and I had to dress up, and we're going to have some expensive jewelry there. Is the hotel specific safe behind in the lobby? Is that a safer place?
It could be, and your hotel room is safe is probably going to be safe. There's 2 things you need to know. The liability for the hotel of you losing something in that hotel room, whether it's safe or not, is very low. It's like a couple $100. I mean, if you lose something, that's the regress you're going to get most times, unless you're able to work with the hotel. But those are usually the laws. It varies state to state. I leave things in the safe all the time. It's a lot better than leaving them out. And if they offer a lockbox or a safety deposit box, that can be safer. But they can usually get into them. The hotel people can usually get into them because people lock them and they can't get back into them, so they need to have a way to do it. The problem I told you about occurred in Africa. And you know, you just shouldn't take too much there anyway. But yeah, if you're going to go to Washington, D.C., and you know, I put my laptop in there if it'll fit. I put, you know, extra things in there. So yeah, it's as safe as it's going to get, and you rely on it. There's just, you need to be careful that it's not foolproof, and you could lose something.
When you say you take an extra credit card when you travel, do you keep that extra credit card on your person, or do you leave it at the hotel?
When I travel internationally, I have a little travel safety sort of thing that fits around my belt loop and drops inside my pants. And so it's sort of a little safety deposit box I carry around with me with a very few things. And then I have my wallet. Yeah.
You mentioned that church headquarters is not a major target, and yet I serve as a missionary on Temple Square, and I know that every square inch is supervised by cameras, and there are security officers everywhere. Why is that?
Church headquarters over the years has had some problems. As you may know, we had a security guard killed in 1999 at the Family History Center by a deranged individual with a gun. The cameras are so that we can actually protect the property without having a security guard everywhere. You can actually sort of watch the public areas of church headquarters from a controlled location. And we do have security officers that vary in times and rotation as to who they are based on the time of day and whatnot. But that's because we've had a lot of people that want to protest on our property. And so the reason for a lot of that is if somebody wants to protest, that's fine. They do it on the public street, not on our property. We want to keep Temple Square sort of a sanctuary where people can come and meditate and enjoy the spirit of the moment without being confronted with protesters. So that's more the reason for it than a safety issue or a security issue. Although we do have a number of security incidents that occur on church property all the time, and we try and manage that by keeping people away that would do that.